He stood at the front of that boardroom, 32 years old, a single father running on 4 hours of sleep and cold coffee, and she looked at him across 12 feet of polished mahogany and asked, in front of every executive who mattered, whether Cresthaven was paying him for strategy or expensive guesswork. Nobody spoke, nobody moved, and Wyatt Brenner did the only thing a man in his position could do. He finished the presentation, collected his materials, and walked out without letting his hands shake until he reached the elevator. That night he decided he was done. Then someone knocked on his front door at 10:00 p. M. and the billionaire, who had been dismantling him piece by piece for 7 months, was standing alone in the rain asking him on a date. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because the stories on this channel don't let go easily, and you don't want to walk in halfway through. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The first thing you need to understand about Wyatt Brenner is that he was not a man who complained. He had learned early the hard way, the kind of hard that leaves permanent marks that complaining changes nothing, and costs energy he couldn't afford to waste. He was 32. He had an 8-year-old daughter named Hallie, who needed new shoes every 4 months because she grew like a weed and refused to stop running everywhere. He had a mortgage that made sense when his wife Claire was alive and felt like a slow bleed every month since she wasn't. He had a job title, Senior Operations Analyst at Cresthaven Industries, that sounded more impressive than it paid, and a commute that added 40 minutes to a day that was already too long. He did not complain. He got up at 5:15 every morning. He made Hallie's lunch the night before, so mornings wouldn't become a war. He dropped her at school by 7:40, was at his desk by 8:30, and worked the kind of focused, deliberate hours that produced results other people took credit for without realizing he'd noticed. He had noticed. He had simply decided it didn't matter as long as the work was good and the paychecks cleared. That calculation held for almost 3 years. Then Lenora Wycliffe became directly involved in his division, and everything got worse. Lenora Wycliffe was not a villain in the way people imagine villains. She didn't cackle, she didn't scheme in dark rooms. She was 50 years old, had built Cresthaven Industries from a consulting firm she started with borrowed money and a reputation she'd constructed through sheer relentless competence, and she had arrived at the stage of her career where she no longer needed to explain herself to anyone. She was brilliant. Everybody said so, including the people who were terrified of her, which was most of them. She was also, and this is the part that the official profiles left out, genuinely difficult in a way that had nothing to do with high standards. There is a difference between a leader who challenges you because they believe in your potential, and a leader who dismantles you because it demonstrates their own superiority. Most people who had worked closely with Lenora Wycliffe for longer than a year had learned to identify which version showed up on any given morning. The safe version asked hard questions and waited for answers. The other version had already decided the answer was wrong and was simply letting you finish speaking as a courtesy. Wyatt had been dealing with the other version for 7 months. It started small, a raised eyebrow at a forecast he presented in Q3. A comment about optimistic projections delivered in a tone that made optimism sound like a character flaw. He had adjusted, tightened his numbers, added more conservative margins. The next month, she found a different weakness. He adjusted again. By month 4, he understood that adjustment wasn't the point. He was the point. Somewhere, for reasons he could not identify, he had become the place where Lenora Wycliffe deposited her sharpest commentary. In group settings, she would listen to 3 other analysts present questionable data with mild corrections, then arrive at his work and dissect it with a precision that felt surgical and deliberate. His colleagues had started giving him sympathetic looks, the kind you give someone who keeps getting called on in a class where the teacher doesn't like them. Marcus Webb, who sat 2 desks over and had been at Cresthaven for 11 years, had pulled Wyatt aside in October and said, with genuine concern, "I don't know what you did to her, but it might be time to think about an exit plan." Wyatt had nodded, said nothing, and gone back to his desk. He hadn't done anything. That was the part he couldn't make sense of. The board presentation in November was supposed to be routine. Cresthaven was evaluating a potential acquisition, a mid-sized logistics company called Paladin Group, and the operations team had gone tasked with modeling integration costs, timeline projections, and risk assessments. Wyatt had led the analysis. He'd spent 3 weeks on it, running numbers late at night after Hallie was asleep, cross-checking assumptions, building in contingency layers that he knew from experience were the difference between a projection that held and one that collapsed the moment reality arrived. He was confident in the work. Not arrogant, confident. There's a difference, and Wyatt knew it. The presentation started well enough. He walked the board through the integration timeline, the projected cost efficiencies, the 3-scenario risk model. The directors asked good questions. He answered them clearly. He could feel the room settling into the comfortable rhythm of a meeting that was going the way it was supposed to go. Then he reached slide 14, the capital expenditure breakdown, and Lenora spoke. Pause there. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when the most powerful person in them decides to intervene. Wyatt paused. He looked at her. Lenora was seated at the far end of the table, a leather portfolio open in front of her, reading glasses on, pen in hand. She hadn't looked up yet. These depreciation assumptions, she said, still looking at the portfolio. Walk me through them. Wyatt walked her through them. He explained the methodology, cited the comparative data he'd used, noted the industry standard benchmarks he'd applied, and where he'd adjusted them for Paladin's specific asset profile. Lenora finally looked up. And you're comfortable with this? Yes, Wyatt said. The methodology is standard, and I've accounted for. Standard methodology applied to non-standard circumstances is a comfortable way to be expensively wrong, Mr. Brenner. Someone shifted in their chair. A director named Patricia Holt studied the grain of the conference table very carefully. Wyatt kept his voice even. I'd be happy to walk through the assumptions in more detail if there's a specific concern. My concern, Lenora said, and now she set down her pen, which was somehow more alarming than anything else, is whether Cresthaven is paying you for strategy or for expensive guesswork. The sentence landed the way those sentences do, with a kind of soft, terrible weight that settles on everyone in the room simultaneously. Nobody looked at Wyatt. Nobody looked at Lenora. The air had that tightened quality of a room full of professionals desperately pretending they hadn't heard what they'd just heard. Wyatt was aware of his own heartbeat. He was aware of how many people were in this room, and how many of them would remember this moment, and how many conversations would happen later in hallways and parking garages about what had just occurred. He took exactly 2 seconds. Then he said calmly, I'd suggest we schedule a working session to go through the depreciation model line by line. If there are flaws, I want to find them before this becomes a decision. He advanced to the next slide. Moving on to the synergy projections, he finished the presentation. 45 minutes. Every slide. Every question from every director answered the same way he would have answered them if the last 2 minutes hadn't happened. He did not rush. He did not stumble. He thanked the board for their time, closed his laptop, and walked out of the room. In the elevator, going down, alone, he pressed the button for the parking garage instead of his floor, rode it all the way down, and sat in his car for 11 minutes without starting the engine. His hands weren't shaking. He was past the shaking stage. He was at the stage where a decision had been made somewhere behind his sternum, quiet and final, the way important decisions often are, not in a flash of anger, but in a moment of absolute cold clarity. He was going to find another job. He was going to leave Cresthaven. And he was going to do it correctly, not in a blaze of resignation letters or dramatic exits, but methodically, the way he did everything. Updating his resume that weekend, quietly reaching out to 2 contacts he'd maintained at competitor firms, giving himself 90 days to land somewhere better before he walked. He thought of Hallie. He thought of the mortgage. He thought about how she'd need braces in 2 years, and how the estimate from the orthodontist had made him grip the steering wheel harder than he'd meant to. He would be careful. He would be smart, but he was done. He got home at 6:47, which was later than he'd told the after-school program, and he paid the late pickup fee without argument and helped Hallie with a worksheet on fractions that she deeply resented on principle. Fractions are stupid, she announced, pressing down on her pencil hard enough that it was a miracle the paper survived. Fractions are everywhere, Wyatt said. Half your pizza. A quarter tank of gas. I don't drive, you will. I'll use the whole pizza. He almost smiled, almost. Yeah, me too. He made pasta for dinner, the kind with the jarred sauce that Hallie preferred over his attempts at homemade. A fact he had stopped taking personally, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she told him about an argument she'd had with her best friend Joss over who got to be team captain at recess, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that he'd cultivated since Claire died, complete, unhurried, as though nothing else existed. Because when he was home, nothing else did. That was the deal he'd made with himself 2 years ago. When he was at work, he worked. When he was home, he was here. Not half here, not mentally in a spreadsheet while nodding along. Here, Hallie had already lost her mother. She wasn't going to lose her father to distraction. After dinner, she fell asleep on the couch before he could get her to bed, which happened at least twice a week. She'd been working on a school project, some kind of poster about community helpers, and the construction paper and markers were spread across the coffee table, the poster half finished, a drawing of a firefighter that looked more like a very determined rectangle with a helmet. Wyatt covered her with the blanket from the arm of the couch and left the project where it was. He poured himself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, and opened his resume. He stared at it for a while. It was a good resume. Solid experience. Clear results. He had built things at Cresthaven that had genuinely helped the company, things that showed up in quarterly earnings even if his name didn't appear in the press releases. He updated the employment dates, added 2 accomplishments from the last year that he hadn't gotten around to documenting, and was considering how to phrase his reason for seeking new opportunities when someone knocked on the front door. He checked the time on his phone. 10:14. He frowned. Marcus sometimes stopped by unannounced, but not this late. His neighbor Greta occasionally knocked if a package had been misdelivered, but not at 10 on a Tuesday. He couldn't think of anyone else who would. He opened the door and stopped. Lenora Wycliffe was standing on his front step. Not a version of Lenora Wycliffe, assembled for public presentation, no assistant hovering at her shoulder, no town car idling at the curb with a driver pretending not to listen, no perfectly structured armor of professional composure. Just a woman standing on a wet front step on a November night in a dark coat with her collar turned up against the cold, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, looking at him with an expression he had never once seen on her face in any boardroom or hallway or meeting room in 7 months of working for her. She looked uncertain. Lenora Wycliffe, in Wyatt's experience, was never uncertain. He stared at her. She looked at him. The silence lasted long enough that it became its own kind of sentence. Then she said, "I know it's late. I know this is—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, seemed to be choosing her words with the kind of care she'd never bothered to apply when she was dismantling him in public. "I know what this looks like." Wyatt said nothing. He was still in the part of this experience where speaking felt impossible because nothing his brain was producing seemed adequate. "I've sitting outside for 20 minutes, she said. In the car, trying to decide whether to knock. "You knocked," he said. His voice came out flat, not hostile, just flat. Emptied out. "I knocked," she exhaled. And then, without the layering of authority she wore like a second skin at Cresthaven, without the deliberate cadence of a woman who had learned to control rooms through the precise deployment of every syllable, she said, "Wyatt, would you go on a date with me?" The November wind moved through the porch light. Somewhere in the living room, Hallie shifted in her sleep and made a small sound. Wyatt looked at the woman who had called his work expensive guesswork 6 hours ago in front of a room full of people who would spend the rest of the week deciding what it meant, and felt something complicated move through his chest. Not warmth, not anger exactly, something that hadn't found its shape yet. He stepped back from the door, not to invite her in, just to have something solid behind him. "You need to explain to me," he said quietly, so he wouldn't wake Hallie, "what you think gives you the right to ask me that question tonight." She opened her mouth. He shook his head once. "I'm going to need a real answer," he said. Not a Cresthaven answer, a real one. And for the first time since he had known her, Lenora Wycliffe closed her mouth, looked at the man standing in the doorway of a modest house on a Tuesday night, and appeared to have no prepared response. Which was, in its own way, the most honest thing she had ever offered him. She was still standing on his front step, and Wyatt was still in the doorway, and neither of them had moved in a long moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was. Lenora Wycliffe, in 48 years of professional life, had never once been told to give a real answer as opposed to a Cresthaven one. The distinction had never occurred to her before, because for most of her adult life, there hadn't been much difference between the two. She had built herself and the company simultaneously, layer by layer, until the professional architecture and the personal woman inside it had become nearly indistinguishable. She was Cresthaven. Cresthaven was her. That was not a problem she had ever felt the need to solve. Standing on a stranger's porch at 10:15 on a Tuesday, however, with the November cold working its way through her coat collar, and a man looking at her with an expression that was neither angry nor forgiving, but simply tired in a way that landed somewhere behind her ribs, she found herself searching for the kind of answer that had nothing to do with quarterly projections, or bored confidence, or the particular vocabulary she'd spent 3 decades constructing. She found it slowly, imperfectly, the way people find real things. "I've been watching you for 7 months," she said. "Not managing you, watching you, and I know how that sounds." "Sounds like what it is," Wyatt said. "I know." She didn't flinch from that. "You don't flatter me. You don't adjust your analysis based on which version of me walks into the room that morning. Every other senior analyst in that building has learned to read my mood and position their numbers accordingly. You don't do that. You present what you found. Even when I push back. Even when she paused. Even when I'm not being fair." The porch light flickered once, the way old fixtures do when the cold gets into the wiring. "That's not a compliment," Wyatt said. "That's not an explanation for tonight." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked away for a moment, at the quiet street, at a neighbor's window with the light still on, at nothing in particular. "I don't do this. I want you to know that. I don't appear at employees' homes. I don't ask. I have never asked anyone anything like what I asked you. I've been trying to figure out how to handle this for 3 months." "Handle what?" She looked back at him directly. That directness was one of the only things about her that seemed the same here as it was in a boardroom. "The fact that I think about you more than I should. The fact that when you're in a room, I'm aware of it differently than I'm aware of other people. The fact that—" She stopped again, pressed her mouth into a brief line, seemed annoyed at herself. "I'm not good at this. You're not good at this," Wyatt repeated. The words were quiet, but they weren't gentle. No. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out whether what they're saying is what they mean, or just a more sophisticated version of what they usually say. He had learned to read Lenora Wycliffe across 7 months of meetings and conference calls and presentations, learned the specific rhythms of her speech when she was genuinely considering something versus when she was performing consideration, and what he saw now was something he hadn't seen before. She was uncomfortable. Not professionally uncomfortable, the mild inconvenience of a situation not proceeding according to plan. Genuinely uncomfortable, the kind that lives in your body, not your strategy. Which meant some part of this was real. But real wasn't the same as okay. "You called my work expensive guesswork," he said, in front of the board. In front of Patricia Holt and David Kwan and 6 other people who influence whether I have a career in this industry. "You've been doing some version of that for 7 months. He kept his voice low, and even the way you keep your voice when a child is asleep 10 feet away, and you don't want to wake her, and you also need to say the true thing without dressing it up. And tonight you drove to my house and knocked on my door because you have feelings for me." Lenora said nothing. "That's what happened," Wyatt said. "I just want to make sure we're describing it the same way." "Yes," she said. "That's what happened. Then I need you to understand something." He shifted against the door frame. "I have an 8-year-old daughter. I have a mortgage I'm barely managing since my wife died. I have a job I need because those 2 things are real, and they don't stop being real because someone who controls my professional future decides she's interested in me. I can't afford. I literally cannot afford the kind of complicated you're describing." Lenora took that in without deflecting it. "I understand," she said. "I don't think you do," he said. Not cruelly, just honestly. "I don't think you have had to understand something like that in a very long time. Maybe ever." She didn't argue, which surprised him. From inside the house, from the direction of the living room, there was a small sound. Hallie shifting again, murmuring something half-formed in her sleep, the particular soft restlessness of a child dreaming. Wyatt turned his head instinctively, the automatic reflex of a parent tracking the whereabouts and condition of the person they are responsible for. When he turned back, Lenora was looking past him. She could see, from where she stood, the edge of the couch, the blanket, the small shape underneath it, the coffee table with the school project, spread across it, the construction paper, the markers, the half-finished drawing of a firefighter that 8-year-old hands had labored over. Something changed in Lenora's face, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. It was quieter than that, a small shift around her eyes, a barely perceptible softening of the particular set of her jaw that usually communicated, in meetings, that she had already finished thinking about something and was simply waiting for others to catch up. She looked at the project on the table for a moment. Then she looked at Wyatt. "She lives here," Lenora said. "Yes," he said. She stopped herself, reorganized. "I knew you had a daughter. I had your file. But I never—" She seemed to be struggling with something that wasn't language. "I never thought about what it meant, for everything else." Wyatt watched her. Every late night, Lenora said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Every meeting you pushed through. You weren't trying to prove something to me." She paused. "You were trying to hold things together for her." "Yeah," Wyatt said. Simple, no elaboration. Another long silence settled between them. This one was different from the first, less confrontational. More like two people standing on either side of a distance that had just become visible to both of them for the first time. "I'm not going to say yes," Wyatt told her, "in case you were waiting to see if the conversation was going somewhere else." "I wasn't," Lenora said, and she didn't look wounded by it or manipulative about it, just present. Like she'd expected exactly this and had come anyway, because she needed to be honest about something, even knowing what the answer would be. "I need you to go," he said. She nodded. She turned to leave. She had made it 2 steps down the porch when Wyatt spoke again. Not because he'd planned to, but because there was one more true thing that needed to be said. "An apology would be a start," he said. "Not tonight. Not on my front porch. In front of the people who heard it." Lenora stopped. She didn't turn around right away.
"I know,"
she said. Then she walked to her car. Wyatt stood in the open door until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he closed it, leaned his back against the wood, and stood there in the quiet of his own hallway for a moment. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel better. He felt tired and unsettled, and a little bit like a man who had just stood at the edge of something he couldn't fully see and chosen, correctly, to step back. He went and sat on the arm of the couch beside Hallie and watched her sleep for a minute. She'd gotten her mother's eyelashes long and dark and slightly dramatic, like Claire had always been slightly dramatic, in the good ways. He picked up a red marker from the coffee table and looked at the unfinished poster. He set the marker down. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. The next morning started the way most of Wyatt's mornings started, the alarm at 5:15, the shower, the coffee brewed while he packed Hallie's lunch, the 10 minutes of organized chaos while Hallie located one missing shoe, disputed the lunch contents, and announced that she had a book report due that she had not mentioned before this moment. "It's due Friday," she said, pulling on her jacket. "Today is Wednesday." "Right. So we have time. How long does it need to be?" 2 pages. "Have you read the book?" A pause. "Most of it." "Hallie, the important parts." He drove her to school with the particular resigned exasperation of a parent who has had this conversation in different forms across several years, and has concluded that his daughter operates on the confidence of someone who has never yet completely failed to pull things together at the last possible moment. She kissed him on the cheek before she got out of the car, which she did every morning, and which he was aware she would eventually stop doing, because 8-year-olds become 10-year-olds become 12-year-olds, and the affection calculus shifts, and so he banked it every morning without saying so. "Love you, Bug," he said. "Love you. Also, I need new markers. Mine are mostly dead." "What list?" "The one in my head." "That's not a real list," she said, and got out of the car. He watched her run through the school entrance without looking back, because she never looked back, and pulled out of the drop-off lane into traffic. He drove toward Cresthaven. He had not decided what today was going to be. He had not decided whether last night had changed anything about his 90-day exit plan. He had not decided what, if anything, he was going to say to Marcus or anyone else who had been in that boardroom. He had decided one thing: he was going to do his job. Correctly. without reducing the quality of his work by a single percentage point to accommodate whatever complicated feeling was sitting in his chest since Lenora Wycliffe had appeared on his front porch. He owed Hallie that. He owed himself that. He parked, badged in, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, poured the second coffee of the morning, the first real one. The home coffee was fuel, the office coffee was ritual, and sat at his desk at 8:31. At 9:45, an email arrived. All staff meeting, executive floor conference room. 10:30. Attendance required for all senior analysts and above. Wyatt looked at the email for a moment. Then he got up, straightened his jacket, and went. The executive floor conference room was larger than the one on 14 and had windows that faced the city rather than the parking structure, which was the most visible way the company communicated that some floors mattered more than others. By 10:28, the room was full 12 senior analysts, 4 department heads, 2 vice presidents, and a handful of people Wyatt recognized from the board presentation the previous afternoon. Patricia Holt was there. David Kwan was there. Marcus was there, standing near the window, and when Wyatt walked in, Marcus gave him a look that communicated without words, in the fluent silent language of people who have worked near each other long enough that Marcus also did not know what this was about and was cautiously concerned. Lenora walked in at 10:30 exactly, no assistant, no papers. She stood at the head of the table and looked around the room with the practiced calm of someone who has run 1,000 meetings and does not need furniture arrangements or name plaques to establish where authority lives. "I'm going to be brief," she said. "I called this meeting because something needs to be corrected, and it needs to be corrected in front of the same people who witnessed it." The room was already quiet. It became a different kind of quiet. Lenora looked at Wyatt. He looked back. "Yesterday," she said, "during the Paladin Group presentation, I questioned Wyatt Brenner's methodology in terms that were neither accurate nor appropriate. I called his analysis expensive guesswork. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I was wrong. The depreciation model in question follows standard methodology correctly applied to the available data. I've had our internal audit team review it overnight. It's sound." Another pause. "More importantly, the way I characterized his work in front of this group crossed the line between demanding excellence and using my position to diminish someone publicly. That's on me, and I'm stating it here, in front of the same people who heard the original comment, because corrections made in private don't undo damage done in public." Wyatt was aware of the particular quality of silence that had taken over the room. It was the silence of professionals encountering something they hadn't predicted and weren't certain how to file. Patricia Holt had looked up from the table she'd been studying so carefully the day before. Marcus was very still near the window. Lenora hadn't looked away from Wyatt through any of it. Not defensive, not performing contrition, just looking at him, letting the words be what they were. She finished by saying, "That's all. Thank you for your time." People began to move, to murmur, to collect themselves and exit with the slightly dazed energy of a room that had expected a routine meeting and gotten something considerably less routine instead. Marcus appeared at Wyatt's shoulder and said, very quietly, "Did you know that was going to happen?" "No," Wyatt said. "Do you know why it happened?" "Yes," Wyatt said. Marcus looked at him, waited. "I told her an apology needed to happen in front of the people who heard it," Wyatt said. Marcus absorbed that. "Then when did she came to my house last night?" Marcus stared at him. "I need coffee," Wyatt said and walked out. He did not go back to his desk immediately. He took the long route, down a hallway that ran along the exterior of the building, with windows looking out over the city, and he walked it slowly, coffee in hand, working through what he felt. Gratitude wasn't quite it. Respect was closer, but still not right. What he actually felt, he realized after a while, was something like the recalibration that happens when a thing you thought you understood turns out to be slightly different from what you'd believed. He had understood Lenora Wycliffe as one specific kind of person. The apology didn't erase the preceding 7 months, but it shifted something, introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for. She had done it, in front of everyone, without conditions. That was harder than he'd expected it to be, to dismiss. But it didn't change his answer. When he got back to his desk, there was a printed note on his keyboard. Not an email. An actual printed note, folded once, his name written on the outside. He opened it. It said, "I don't expect that to change anything. I just needed it to be true." He folded it. put it in his jacket pocket. Then he opened his laptop and got back to work. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that periods of recalibration are always strange outwardly the same, inwardly different in ways that don't announce themselves clearly. Wyatt's exit plan was still open in a browser tab he hadn't closed. He had made the 2 contacts at competitor firms. One had responded warmly and mentioned a position that might open in Q1. He kept the conversation going, kept his options warm, and told himself that none of what had happened changed the fundamental logic of finding somewhere to work where his professional standing didn't depend on the mood of one person. That logic held, but the weeks kept passing and Lenora kept behaving differently. Not perfectly. That was the thing. If she had been perfect about it, unfailingly warm, carefully supportive, performing a 180 designed to change his mind, it would have been easier to dismiss. But she wasn't perfect. She was inconsistent in the specific way that real change is inconsistent, making progress and then slipping, catching herself slipping, adjusting. She stopped singling him out for the sharpest criticism. She didn't suddenly become easy on his work. Lenora Wycliffe was constitutionally incapable of being easy on anyone's work. And Wyatt would have trusted her less if she'd tried. But the difference between rigorous scrutiny and targeted diminishment became visible in her behavior in ways it hadn't been before. She pushed back on Marcus's projections with the same intensity she applied to Wyatt's. She disagreed with Patricia Holt's risk assessment in a Thursday meeting with the same bluntness she'd once reserved specifically for him. She was still difficult. She was just difficult in a way that didn't feel like a weapon aimed at one person. In mid-December, she passed him in the hallway near the elevator bay. They were alone. It was 4:50 in the afternoon, and most of the floor had already started making their way toward the exit. She stopped. He stopped. "The Q1 projections you submitted Tuesday," she said. "Yes. I read them last night. They're the best risks modeling I've seen from this division in 3 years." He waited for the qualifier, the however. It didn't come. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, pressed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, she said, without looking at him, "How's your daughter?" He blinked. "She's fine," he said. "Good." She finished her book report. Lenora almost smiled. The corners of her mouth moved barely, in a way that in any other face would have been a full smile. In hers it was the equivalent. "Good," she said. The doors closed. Wyatt stood in the hallway for a moment. He walked back to his desk and looked at the browser tab that had his updated resume in it. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't close it. But he didn't send anything either. The first week of January arrived with the kind of cold that gets into the bones of a building, made the Cresthaven offices feel slightly more sealed off from the world than usual. Wyatt had stopped thinking about Lenora's visit in November as an isolated incident and had started thinking about it as a data point, one piece of information among several that he was still in the process of assessing. Then the data changed. He was running the Paladin integration models again. The acquisition hadn't been approved yet. Still moving through the board's due diligence phase, and something in the numbers stopped him. Not an error exactly. More like a shape he didn't recognize. A pattern in the monthly variance reports that should have been random noise, but wasn't, quite. He pulled comparative data going back 8 months, laid it out, and looked at it the way he looked at anything that didn't immediately make sense, without deciding what it meant until he'd let it sit in front of him long enough to tell him. It took him the better part of 2 days to see it clearly. And when he did, he sat very still at his desk for a long moment. The variance wasn't random. It had a direction. It was small enough, month over month, that you'd miss it unless you were looking for it, or unless you'd been staring at these specific numbers long enough to develop a feel for what normal looked like. And what Wyatt was looking at was not normal. Someone had been adjusting the reports. Not dramatically, not sloppily, carefully, with the specific patience of someone who understood that large discrepancies get caught, and small ones accumulate into something that over time tells a different story than the original data. He printed 3 months of reports and laid them side by side. Then he pulled the original submissions, the versions that had been filed in the system, before any revisions and compared them. The differences were small. They were real. And they pointed consistently in one direction, toward a version of Paladin's integration value that was higher than the actual numbers supported. Higher in a way that would make the acquisition look better than it was. higher in a way that would influence Lenora's decision. Wyatt sat back in his chair and looked at what he'd found. Then he thought about something that had bothered him since November. Since the board presentation. Since Lenora had called his analysis expensive guesswork. He went back and looked at his original depreciation model, the one Lenora had attacked, the one the audit team had subsequently cleared. He pulled his original submission from the archive. He compared it to the version that had been presented in the meeting. They were different, not in a way that changed the conclusion, but in a way specific, targeted adjustments to two assumptions in slide 14 that made the methodology look shakier than it actually was. That made the version Lenora had seen look less rigorous than the version Wyatt had actually built. He stared at the screen. The version Lenora had attacked hadn't been entirely his. Someone had touched it before it reached her. He saved everything. Immediately, without waiting, he created backups in 3 separate locations: his personal cloud storage, an encrypted external drive he kept in his desk drawer for exactly the kind of situation you can never predict but should be prepared for, and a forwarded email chain to a personal address that created a time-stamped record outside the company's own servers. Then he sat at his desk, in the January cold of an office that was starting to empty around him, and thought about what he was holding. He thought about who could access the financial systems the way these changes required. He thought about who would benefit from inflating the Paladin acquisition's projected value. He thought about who had the patience to make adjustments this careful and this gradual. He thought about a name that had been at the edges of every significant financial decision at Cresthaven for the past 2 years. Dorian Voss, Executive Vice President of Corporate Strategy. Long tenure, Lenora's trust, access to everything. Wyatt didn't jump to a conclusion. He wasn't built that way. But he held the name against what he'd found, and the fit was uncomfortable and specific in the way that things that are true often are. He needed more. He also needed to be extremely careful about who he spoke to and when, because if he was right, the person responsible had already demonstrated a willingness to alter evidence in a way that directed Lenora's attention and frustration toward Wyatt, specifically, which meant someone had been using Lenora as an instrument. And somewhere behind that thought was another one, quieter and more complicated, Lenora's relentless scrutiny of his work these past months. Her specific, pointed, almost personal focus on his projections above everyone else's. He had assumed it was arbitrary. He had assumed it was personal, in the cold way of someone who had decided he was a useful target. He was no longer sure that was the whole story. He closed his laptop. He sat in the empty office and listened to the building settle around him in the cold, the small sounds of a structure doing what structures do, contracting in the dark. He did not yet know what Lenora had suspected. He did not yet know why she had pushed him the way she had. He was not yet in possession of that particular piece. But he was beginning to understand that the story he'd been living inside for 7 months had more rooms in it than he'd been shown. Somewhere in those rooms was the truth about what had actually been happening to him at Cresthaven Industries and what it was going to cost everyone when it came fully into the light. He put on his coat. He drove home. He helped Hallie with her spelling words, burned the grilled cheese a little on one side because he was distracted, and ate it anyway without mentioning it. And when she asked why he was quiet, he told her he had a work problem he was thinking about. "Is it math?" she asked. "Sort of. I'm good at math now," she said, with the confidence of someone who had recently conquered fractions and considered this a permanent upgrade to her capabilities. "I know," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." She went to bed at 8:30, and he sat at the kitchen table with the printed reports spread out in front of him, the specific numbers circled in red pen, and worked through what he knew and what he could prove and what he still needed to find. He worked until nearly midnight. He did not update his resume that night. He was no longer thinking about leaving. He was thinking about something harder and more necessary and considerably more dangerous, staying and finding out exactly how deep this went. He spent the next 3 days building a case, the way you build anything that has to hold weight slowly, carefully, with attention to every joint and connection, because the thing you're constructing is only as strong as your least careful moment. Wyatt was not a reckless man. He had never been reckless. Recklessness was a luxury available to people who didn't have an 8-year-old depending on them to make good decisions. And he had understood that particular truth so deeply and for so long that caution had become less a habit than a reflex. He checked twice. He backed up everything. He followed every thread to its end before he picked up the next one. What he found over those 3 days was worse than he'd initially understood. The alterations to the financial reports weren't limited to the Paladin acquisition model. They went further back 5 months further, into the Q2 variance analysis, into the August risk assessment, into 2 separate projections that had been submitted under Wyatt's name and had subsequently been used to justify budget decisions that, in retrospect, made a particular kind of sense if you were trying to position Cresthaven for a specific outcome. An outcome that involved acquiring Paladin Group at a price that was roughly 30% higher than the actual integration value could support. Someone had been building a case for a bad deal, and they'd been building it with Wyatt's name on it. He sat with that for a full evening, the kitchen table again, the printed reports again, Hallie asleep upstairs. The house quiet in that particular way it got after 8:30, when the daily noise of a child organizing the world according to her own logic finally wound down. He sat with it and turned it over and looked at it from every angle he could find. The question wasn't whether Dorian Voss had done this. Wyatt was now as certain of that as he could be without a confession. The original file submissions, the ones archived in the system, with timestamp data that Wyatt had managed to pull through a reporting function that most people didn't know existed because it had been built into the database for audit purposes, and was not exactly advertised, showed modification times that placed the alterations outside Wyatt's access windows. He was in the building or on the network during specific hours. The changes had been made at times he wasn't. Dorian Voss had broad system access. Dorian Voss had been at Cresthaven for 9 years. Dorian Voss had advocated loudly and consistently for the Paladin acquisition at every strategic discussion Wyatt had attended. The question that actually kept Wyatt awake, the one he turned over and over without being able to set it down, was a different one entirely. How much did Lenora know? He didn't want to ask it. He had constructed a version of recent events in which Lenora's behavior was a separate issue, the apology, the changed approach, the brief moments of something that felt like genuine recognition that could exist independently of whatever else was happening in the financial systems. He had kept those two things compartmentalized because it was cleaner that way, and because the alternative required him to consider something he was not entirely prepared to consider. But evidence doesn't care about what you're prepared for. He had found in the audit trail something small and specific that he couldn't explain away. A query, a read-only access log, the kind generated when someone views a file without modifying it, that showed Lenora's administrative account accessing Wyatt's original Q3 depreciation model. Not the altered version, the original. 6 weeks before the board presentation where she'd called his work expensive guesswork. She had seen the original model. She had known his methodology was sound. And then she had stood in that boardroom and questioned it publicly. Wyatt closed the laptop and put his hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. He was not a man who let himself spiral. He had learned, the hard way and the long way, that the space between a thing you've discovered and a conclusion you've drawn is a space worth inhabiting long enough to make sure you're reading it correctly. So he sat in it. He breathed. He resisted the immediate story that she had known and attacked him anyway, that the apology was cover, that the note and the hallway conversation and the tiny movement at the corner of her mouth when he mentioned Hallie's book report were all part of something calculated. He resisted it because he wasn't certain it was true, and because he needed to know. He called her office the next morning at 7:45, before his floor was populated, and asked her assistant to pass along a message that Wyatt Brenner was requesting a private meeting at her earliest convenience regarding a financial compliance matter. The language was deliberate. Financial compliance had a specific meaning at Cresthaven. It triggered a documentation requirement that meant the meeting would be logged, that he would have a record of having requested it, that if anything happened to him professionally in the following weeks, there would be a time-stamped trail of exactly when he'd raised a concern, and with whom. He was not being paranoid. He was being careful. Those are different things. Lenora's assistant called back at 8:20 and offered a slot at 11. He took it. He spent the intervening hours at his desk, doing the regular work of the day, answering emails about Q1 projections that now felt almost academic given what he knew was sitting underneath them, and trying to look like a man who was having a normal Wednesday. At 10:58, he rode the elevator to the executive floor. Lenora's office occupied the corner of the building that got the morning light until just past noon, which gave it a particular quality at this hour, not warm exactly, but present in the way that natural light in a corporate building rarely manages to be. She was standing at the window when her assistant showed Wyatt in, looking at the city with her arms crossed, and she turned when she heard the door. "Close it," she said to the assistant. The door closed. Wyatt set his folder on the small conference table that occupied one corner of the office, not the main desk, which maintained a particular power geometry that he didn't want to navigate today, and sat down. She came and sat across from him. "You said financial compliance," she said.
Yes.
She studied his face. "How bad?" "Depends on how much you already know," he said. A pause. Something moved in her expression. "Walk me through it," she said. So he did. He opened the folder and laid out what he'd found, in order, without editorializing. The modification timestamps, the original versus altered versions of his reports. The pattern of adjustments across 5 months and multiple submissions. The directional consistency, every change pushing Paladin's projected integration value upward, making the acquisition look better than the actual numbers supported. He put it in front of her, piece by piece, and let her read it, and he watched her face while she did. She didn't interrupt. She read everything he put in front of her with the focused attention of someone who has spent 30 years learning to process financial documentation at speed, and her expression did not change in the way expressions change when someone is hearing something for the first time, versus the way they change when someone is confronting something they had already partially understood. When he finished, she sat back. "You want to know what I knew," she said.
Yes.
She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a distant sound of street traffic. The building settling in the January cold. "I suspected," she said, "that someone in the senior leadership structure was manipulating internal data. I had been suspicious for 4 months. I did not know who, and I did not know how, and I did not have enough to act on it without evidence." 4 months, Wyatt said. "Yes, that's around the time you started." He stopped, chose the word. "Around the time your approach to my presentations became noticeably different." She held his gaze. Yes, the thing in Wyatt's chest that had been unresolved since January midnight at his kitchen table was looking for a shape, and it was starting to find one, and the shape was not simple. "Explain that to me," he said. His voice was even. He worked to keep it that way. Lenora placed her hands flat on the table. It was, he noticed, with something he couldn't entirely name, the same gesture he had made the night before on his own kitchen table. "I suspected the manipulation was in the financial projections," she said. "I didn't know where or how deep. I needed to find it. The most reliable way to find falsified data in a complex financial system is to have someone methodical and independent run the numbers without knowing they're looking for fraud, because a person who knows what they're looking for can be led, and a person who doesn't know is just following the evidence wherever it actually goes." Wyatt stared at her. "You used me," he said. "I challenged you," she said. "I pushed your analysis harder than anyone else's because yours was the work I needed to stress test. If the numbers in your reports held up under that level of scrutiny, it told me something. If they didn't, that's the same thing," Wyatt said. "That's the same sentence with different vocabulary." She didn't look away. "I know. In front of the board," he said. "In front of David Kwan and Patricia Holt and 8 other people who have opinions about my career. You called my work expensive guesswork. You have a read log in your system that shows you accessed my original model 6 weeks before that meeting. You knew it was sound." "Yes," she said. "So explain that part." His voice had dropped slightly. Not louder, quieter. The particular quiet of someone who is holding something down that wants to surface. "Explain the board meeting, specifically, because scrutinizing my numbers in a closed session is one thing. What you did in that boardroom was something different." Lenora was quiet, longer than she'd been quiet before. Long enough that Wyatt understood she was not organizing facts. She was deciding whether to say the true thing. "I was afraid," she said finally. He waited. "I had been watching you for months," she said. "Watching you work. Watching the way you handled difficulty. The way you held yourself together in meetings where most people, would have broken. The way you went home to that little girl at night and came back the next morning and did it again. She stopped. Something in her jaw tightened slightly, the specific tension of a person who has been honest enough to become uncomfortable. I was attracted to you. I had been for months, and it was creating a problem for me, professionally, structurally, personally, that I did not know how to handle because I am not someone who doesn't know how to handle things. I handle things. That's what I do. But you didn't handle this, Wyatt said. I let it become pressure, she said. The harder I pushed your work, the more distance I was creating. The more professional distance there was, the safer it felt. She paused. That's not a justification. I'm telling you the mechanism. The board meeting, that specific moment, that was the mechanism running away from me. I pushed too hard because I was frightened. Wyatt looked at her for a long time. You were frightened, he said, so I paid for it. Yes, she said. The word sat in the room between them, plain and undefended. Wyatt stood up. He walked to the window. He stood where she'd been standing when he came in, looking at the city without seeing it, processing a thing that was complicated in the specific way that things are complicated when the person who hurt you turns out to have done it for reasons that are almost human. Almost not entirely. Not enough. He turned around. You don't get to hurt someone, he said, because you're afraid of needing them. She took that in without deflecting it. She sat at the table and took it in the way she'd taken his refusal on his front porch without the armor of authority, without the maneuver, just sitting with the weight of it. No, she said, you don't. He came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at the folder of documents between them. We need to talk about what happens with this, he said. Yes, she said, we do, Dorian Voss. She nodded. Something in her expression tightened. I've had my own suspicions about Dorian for 6 weeks. Since November. But what you've found. She pulled 2 of the pages closer and looked at them again. This is what I didn't have. The timestamp data. I didn't know about the audit function that generated those logs. Most people don't, Wyatt said. It was built for external compliance review. It's not documented anywhere inside the company's own system guides. How did you find it? I was looking, he said simply. She almost smiled. That same barely perceptible movement. Of course you were. They sat with the documents for another 20 minutes, Wyatt walking her through the specific data points, Lenora asking precise questions that told him she had already understood most of the architecture of what Dorian had done, even without the specific evidence Wyatt had now provided. She had been operating, for months, on instinct and partial information. What Wyatt had built was the actual proof. As the meeting came to a close, Lenora gathered the copies he'd brought. He kept the originals and said, I'm going to contact the independent auditors today. This goes outside the company's internal channels immediately. I'm not giving Dorian the opportunity to know we're looking. Agreed, Wyatt said. He picked up his folder. Wyatt, she said. He stopped. What I said to you in November, she said. On your porch. About watching you, about being attracted to you. She paused. That was the most honest thing I've said to another person in a long time. I need you to know that it's separate from this. What we just went through in this room, the professional situation, the investigation, what I'm about to do with those auditors, that's not connected to what I told you on your porch. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. He went back to his desk. He did not feel better. He did not feel vindicated or relieved, or the specific lightness that people describe when the truth finally emerges. What he felt was the dense, complicated weight of a situation that had just become significantly more real and considerably more dangerous, because what he'd found and what they'd discussed would not stay contained for long, and the person who had built this particular structure over the previous 5 months was not going to discover it was unraveling and respond by doing nothing. He knew that. He also knew that he had done the right thing. Not because it was clean or safe or simple, because Hallie deserved a father who did the right thing even when it was none of those other things. He thought about that. He held on to it. He kept working. 3 weeks passed. The independent auditors came in under the cover of a routine compliance review, standard enough at a company Cresthaven's size that it didn't generate unusual attention, which was precisely the point. Wyatt provided his documentation through a separate channel arranged by Lenora's outside legal team. He continued showing up to his regular meetings, submitting his regular work, behaving in every observable way like a man who was having a normal January and early February. He was not having a normal January and early February. He was watching. Dorian Voss was 44, tall, the kind of polish that comes from decades of careful self-construction, with the easy confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in a professional environment. He had a way of commanding a room by occupying it, fully filling the conversational space, making himself the gravitational center of any group he walked into. He was charming in the specific, tactical way of people who have learned that charm is leverage. Wyatt had always found him slightly exhausting without being able to fully articulate why. Now he could articulate it. Dorian moved through the office in those 3 weeks exactly as he always had. That was either evidence that he didn't know the auditors were looking, or evidence that he was very good at behaving normally under pressure. Wyatt wasn't sure which, and he was careful not to let the uncertainty make him careless. The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-February. Wyatt was at his desk when Marcus appeared beside him, leaned down quietly, and said, "Dorian just went into Lenora's office. He went in about 10 minutes ago. I was walking past and Marcus paused. It didn't look social. Wyatt saved what he was working on. Are the auditors still in the building?" he asked. "I think they left at noon." Wyatt thought for a moment. "Go back to your desk," he said. "Act normal." "What does normal look like right now?" "Like you don't know anything," Wyatt said. "Which, officially, you don't." Marcus gave him a look that communicated several things simultaneously, then straightened up and went back to his desk. Wyatt sat and thought. The meeting between Dorian and Lenora lasted 37 minutes. He knew because he was aware of the time, in the way you become aware of time when something is happening in a building you're in that you're not yet part of, but that is moving toward you. At 4:15, his phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number that he recognized as the secondary contact Lenora's legal team had given him for exactly this kind of situation. It said, "He knows the audit is not routine. Meeting has become adversarial. Stay in the building." Wyatt read it twice. He forwarded it, along with a brief note about the context, to his personal email. He backed up the 3 most recent files he'd been working on. He opened his desk drawer and checked that the external drive was where it always was. Then he waited. At 4:52, another message from the same number, board meeting called. "Emergency, 5:30. Executive floor, you are being named." He read it again. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, which was all the time he allowed himself. Then he packed his bag documents, external drive, laptop, and thought about what was actually being asked of him here. Not in the abstract. Specifically. Concretely. He was being named, which meant Dorian had made a move, which meant Dorian had something he was planning to use, which meant the next hour and a half would determine a significant amount about how the subsequent months and years of Wyatt Brenner's life would be arranged. He could leave. He could be unavailable. He could be a man who got a concerning message and made the rational decision to consult a lawyer before entering a room where someone was making allegations against him. All of those were defensible choices. He sat with them for a moment. Then he thought about what it meant specifically, practically, concretely, if Dorian succeeded tonight. He thought about Lenora in that room without the documentation that lived in Wyatt's folder and on Wyatt's external drive. He thought about a board that might, if the information was presented a certain way, draw a certain conclusion. He thought about the audit report that wasn't finished yet and the 6 weeks it might take to complete, and the damage that could happen in 6 weeks to a company and a reputation, and a woman who had, on his front porch in November, said the most honest thing she'd said to another person in a long time. He thought about what Hallie would eventually ask him, not at 8, but at 16 or 20. At whatever age, she started asking him the real questions about who he was and what he wanted to be able to tell her. He picked up his bag. He sent one message to the secondary number, "I'll be there." He took the elevator to the executive floor. The doors of the large conference room were closed, and through the glass panel beside them, he could see that people were already assembled board members, mostly, though the room was not as full as it would have been for a scheduled meeting. Emergency gatherings pulled whoever could be reached quickly. Patricia Holt was there, David Kwan, 3 other board members. Lenora at the head of the table, her expression giving nothing away, which Wyatt now understood as the specific composure of someone managing a situation they hadn't chosen. Dorian was standing near the side wall, talking to the company's general counsel with the body language of someone who had prepared for this room. Wyatt pushed the door open and walked in. The conversation near the wall stopped. Dorian turned. Their eyes met across the room, and in the specific silence of that moment, the board members looking up, Lenora's gaze moving to Wyatt, the general counsel going carefully. Still, Wyatt understood with a clarity that had nothing academic about it that he had just made a choice that was going to cost him something, in time or difficulty or both, regardless of how the next hour went. He was okay with that. He set his bag on the table and sat down. Dorian watched him sit. Then Dorian said, to the room in the smooth and confident tone of a man who had prepared his opening, "Now that everyone is present, I think we can begin." Wyatt opened his folder, and the real fight started. Dorian had prepared well. That was the first thing Wyatt registered, because fairness required registering it. The presentation Dorian delivered to the board in the next 20 minutes was constructed with the specific intelligence of someone who had been building it in his head, since at least the moment the audit request came in, possibly longer. Possibly since he'd first begun altering the reports and had started thinking about contingencies. The core of it was simple and it was ugly. Dorian presented what he described as documentary evidence, that Wyatt and Lenora had been in a personal relationship for months, that this relationship had compromised Lenora's oversight of the operations division, and that the two of them together had manipulated the financial models, supporting the Paladin acquisition to create grounds for proceeding with a deal that would personally benefit them through a complex equity arrangement that Dorian described. With the fluency of someone who had designed it specifically to be difficult to refute quickly. It was a framing, a constructed narrative, but it was built on real materials, the same financial documents everyone had been looking at for months, recontextualized and selectively presented in a way that told a coherent story. Patricia Holt asked two sharp questions. David Kwan asked one. The room had the particular tension of people being asked to believe something they weren't sure they believed, but could not immediately disprove. Dorian was good at this. Wyatt could see why he'd gotten as far as he had for as long as he had. Then Wyatt spoke. He didn't ask for the floor. He didn't raise his hand. He simply opened his folder and said, to the room, in the same even voice he used for every presentation he'd ever given at Cresthaven, "I want to walk you through something." He started with the timestamps. He had printed them cleanly, with the file names and modification records clearly formatted, and he had made copies for every person in the room, because a document you can hold is more credible than one projected on a screen, and he had thought about that before he packed his bag. He distributed the copies. He waited while people looked at them. Then he explained, in plain language, what an audit-generated access log was and how the timestamp data it contained demonstrated a specific pattern of modification to financial documents outside of any access window attributable to Wyatt. He was careful. He was specific. He did not editorialize, and he did not get emotional, and he did not at any point say Dorian Voss's name without immediately anchoring it to a documented fact. He went for 40 minutes. Partway through, around the 15-minute mark, when the timestamps for the Q3 variance report were on the table, and David Kwan had picked up his copy and was looking at it, with the expression of a man beginning to recalculate, Lenora opened the leather portfolio sheet, carried in and added her own documentation to the table. It was the independent audit's preliminary findings, not the final report, the preliminary. But preliminary findings from an independent audit firm, formally letterheaded and signed, carry a particular weight in a boardroom that personal testimony doesn't always manage. She put it in front of the board members without comment and let it do what documentation does when it's real. Dorian's prepared fluency developed a crack around the 20-minute mark of Wyatt's presentation. The crack was small. He covered it well. But it was there a moment where he reached for a counter-argument and found that the counter-argument required him to assert something the timestamp data directly contradicted, and the assertion didn't survive contact with the document people were holding in their hands. Patricia Holt set down her copy of the timestamp report, looked at Dorian, and said, in a tone that had shed whatever diplomatic coating it normally carried, Dorian, "Explain the access time on October 14th, specifically." Dorian explained. His explanation was smooth. It was also insufficient. David Kwan asked the same question about the August modification. The explanation was less smooth the second time. The room was changing. Wyatt could feel it, not a dramatic shift, but a gradual one. The particular recalibration of a group of intelligent people who had come in prepared to hear one version of events and were now holding evidence that complicated it in ways they couldn't simply dismiss. Dorian tried twice more. He pivoted to the personal relationship allegation, the one that didn't depend on financial documentation, and held it up as context that colored everything else. He was practiced at this. He made it sound plausible. He made it sound like the kind of thing that explained the pattern of behavior without requiring the timestamp data to be wrong. And then Lenora spoke. She had been largely quiet through Wyatt's presentation, adding documentation where she had it and letting him carry the factual argument. Now she spoke with the particular authority of someone who has decided to stop managing the temperature of a room and simply say the true thing. "Let me be direct about something," she said, and the room went completely still. "Wyatt Brenner and I are not in a relationship. We have not been in a relationship. I went to his home in November and asked him on a date. He declined." She paused. "He declined because I had spent 7 months treating him in a way that didn't deserve a yes. He was right. That conversation is the extent of any personal contact between us outside of professional settings." She looked around the room. "I'm telling you this directly, because the allegation is designed to use my conduct toward him as evidence of collusion. It isn't collusion. It's a record of me behaving badly toward an employee, and him maintaining his professional integrity throughout." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Dorian began to say something. "I'm not finished," Lenora said, and the room accepted that without question, because when Lenora Wycliffe said she wasn't finished, rooms waited. "The independent audit will be complete in 3 weeks," she continued. "The preliminary findings, which you have in front of you, establish that the financial modifications in question are inconsistent with Mr. Brenner's documented access patterns and consistent with a different access profile. I am asking the board to table any decisions related to the Paladin acquisition pending the full audit report, and I am formally requesting that the board authorize the retention of outside legal counsel to review the complete findings upon receipt." She set her hands flat on the table. "That's what I'm asking. What you do with it is, appropriately, your decision." Patricia Holt looked at David Kwan. David Kwan looked at the preliminary audit findings in his hand. Dorian, from the side of the room, said, "This is a deflection." "The acquisition timeline, Dorian," said the board's legal chair, in a tone that was not unkind but was final. "I think you should stop talking now." He stopped. The board voted 20 minutes later to table the acquisition and authorize outside legal counsel. The vote was unanimous. Dorian left the room ahead of everyone else, and the specific quality of his exit too controlled, too deliberate. The walk of a man choosing to look composed, rather than actually feeling. It told Wyatt everything he needed to know about what happened next. The room emptied gradually. Board members collected their documents, spoke in low tones to each other, flowed toward the exit in the subdued way that follows a meeting that has been more significant than anyone prepared for. Marcus appeared at Wyatt's elbow from somewhere. Wyatt still wasn't entirely sure how Marcus had gotten into this meeting. But Marcus had been at Cresthaven 11 years and had a specific gift for being present at moments that mattered without technically having been invited. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Ask me in a week," Wyatt said. "Is that good or bad?" "It's honest," Wyatt said. He was the last one packing up his bag, which left him and Lenora alone in the conference room when the door swung closed behind the final board member. She was still at the head of the table, sitting with her hands in her lap, not reaching for her portfolio or her phone, just sitting in the room that had just decided something. She looked tired, not defeated, not broken, just tired, in the way that people look when they've been carrying something at full tension for a very long time and have just been allowed to set part of it down. It aged her in a way that was, he noticed, human in a way her boardroom composure never was. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said, not harshly. "Just straight." She looked at him. "You needed the documentation," he said. "I had it, that's why I came. I know," she said. "I also know that's not the whole reason." He didn't answer that. Because she was right, and she knew she was right, and he wasn't ready to negotiate what the rest of the reason meant. He closed his bag. "Go home," he told her. "Get some sleep." "Where are you going?" she asked. "Home," he said. "My daughter saved me half a grilled cheese. I told her I'd be late, but I'd be back." Lenora looked at him across the length of the conference table. "You always go back," she said. It wasn't a question. It was something else, observation and admission simultaneously. From a woman who had spent enough of her life not going back to things that she recognized the habit of someone who did. Yeah, Wyatt said, I do. He picked up his bag and walked to the door. He was tired in the deep, bone-based way of someone who has spent an entire day operating at the edge of their capacity and has held the line and is now paying the physical price of that. He was not exhilarated. He did not feel heroic. He felt like a man who needed to sit down somewhere quiet, eat half a cold grilled cheese, and listen to an 8-year-old tell him something that had nothing to do with any of this. That was, he thought as he stepped into the elevator, the only thing he actually wanted right now. The building descended around him, floor by floor, until he was at the lobby level, and the doors opened, and the cold February air hit him from the revolving door, and he walked through it and into the parking garage and got in his car. He drove home. He turned on the street, and the light in the living room was on. He parked. He sat in the car for exactly 30 seconds. Not processing, not deciding. Just sitting, letting the day become the past before he walked into the present. Then he picked up his bag and went inside. Hallie had saved him half a grilled cheese. Not wrapped in foil, not on a plate covered with another plate the way a parent would have done. She'd left it directly on the cutting board with a sticky note pressed beside it that said, in her handwriting, the particular handwriting of an 8-year-old who had recently decided cursive was more sophisticated, but hadn't yet committed to the decision, Dad. Don't throw this away. I saved it. Love, H. He stood in the kitchen reading the note. He ate the cold grilled cheese standing at the counter. It was, without any irony or sentimentality, one of the better things he'd eaten in recent memory. He checked on Hallie asleep, legitimately this time, in her actual bed, which happened more reliably when he wasn't home by 6, because she stayed up reading under the covers until she heard his car in the driveway. A habit she believed was secret and was not. And then he sat at the kitchen table for a while without turning on the overhead light, just the small lamp on the counter, and let the day exist at a distance for a while. He thought about the conference room. He thought about Dorian's face at the moment the board chair told him to stop talking. He thought about Lenora sitting at the head of the table after everyone else had left, looking tired in the way that revealed something real. He thought about what came next, because what came next was not resolved. The board had voted, the audit was ongoing, the legal review was authorized. Those things were in motion. But motion and resolution are different, and the space between them is where things go wrong in ways that meetings can't predict. He went to bed at 12:30. He slept better than he expected to. The 3 weeks following the board meeting were the strangest professional period of Wyatt's career. And his career had included a stretch of 6 months where he'd done contract analysis for a company that turned out to be conducting its own quiet disintegration, so he had some basis for comparison. Dorian Voss did not disappear quietly. He had been in corporate environments long enough to know that the period between an allegation and a final determination is not a waiting room, it's a battlefield. He worked that period with the specific persistence of someone who has learned that outcomes are not fixed until they're fixed, and that public narrative often moves faster than formal process. He had conversations. He cultivated doubt. He was careful not to say anything that could be documented as defamatory, but he operated in the specific register of someone who can imply a great deal with very careful language, a raised eyebrow here, a question there. The particular kind of silence after someone's name is mentioned that communicates something without technically asserting anything. Wyatt heard about some of it through Marcus, who had a network of information at Cresthaven that operated via channels. Wyatt had never fully mapped, but had long respected. Marcus appeared at Wyatt's desk 2 or 3 times a week in those 3 weeks, with the expression of someone delivering news he'd rather not be delivering. He had lunch with Garfield from legal, Marcus said one Tuesday, perching on the edge of the desk. An hour and a half. I don't know what was said. Is Garfield someone who matters here? Garfield has been Dorian's inside contact for 4 years. So yes. Okay, you're very calm about this, Marcus observed. I've done what I can do, Wyatt said. The rest is the audit. The audit takes 3 more weeks. Yes, Wyatt said. Marcus looked at him. You're not actually calm. You're doing the thing where you perform calm because it's the only productive option. That's the same thing, Wyatt said. Functionally. Marcus made a sound that communicated skepticism, but conceded the point. Wyatt kept working. He submitted his Q1 projections, the real numbers. his actual methodology, with no alterations, because the person who had been altering them no longer had the operational cover to continue. He attended his regular meetings. He answered his emails. He picked Hallie up from school on Thursdays and helped with homework and made dinners of varying success and kept the rhythm of the life that was not the office, because the life that was not the office was the reason everything else mattered. Lenora, during those 3 weeks, gave him room. He appreciated that more than he expected to. She did not call impromptu meetings. She did not send messages through the secondary legal channel. She did not appear at his desk or manufacture reasons to cross his professional path. In the one situation where they were both required to attend the same strategy session, a routine departmental review that had been scheduled before any of this began, she treated him with the specific professional respect of someone who had drawn a clear line and was honoring it. After the session, as people were filing out, she passed him in the doorway and said quietly, without stopping, "The audit is on schedule." "Good," he said, that was all. He stood in the hallway after she'd moved past and thought about how much easier it would have been, how much simpler the entire preceding 4 months would have been if that had been the register of their interaction from the beginning. Professional, respectful, direct. He also thought that simpler wasn't always what taught you something. He wasn't sure what to do with that thought, so he went back to his desk and kept working. The full audit report arrived on a Thursday morning in early March, delivered by the outside firm directly to the board chair, Patricia Holt, and to Cresthaven's external legal counsel. Wyatt knew it had arrived because Patricia Holt's administrative coordinator sent a meeting invitation at 9:40 in the morning for a board session that afternoon. And the subject line said simply, "Audit Findings Full Board." He had not been invited. That was appropriate. The findings were addressed to the board, not to him. Whatever happened next happened in that room, and whatever they decided would come down to him afterward through the formal channels of institutional decision-making. He understood this. He accepted it without the particular anxiety that he might have felt at a different point in his life, when uncertainty was less familiar company. He went to lunch at 12:30, ate a sandwich at a cafe 2 blocks from the building, and spent 30 minutes not thinking about the meeting that was happening, or would happen, or had happened. He wasn't sure about the timing, and instead thinking about Hallie's approaching school science fair, for which she had decided to build a demonstration of how bridges distribute weight, a decision that had been inspired by a children's book about engineering and that would require materials. Wyatt had promised to help acquire by Friday. He was making a mental list of what he needed from the hardware store when his phone buzzed. Patricia Holt. He stared at the name on his screen for a moment. Then he answered. "Mr. Brenner," she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been on boards long enough to deliver news without announcing what the news was going to be before she delivered it. "Do you have a few minutes?" "Yes," he said. "The audit findings are comprehensive," she said, "and they corroborate everything you provided. The modifications to the financial reports have been traced definitively. The board has made several decisions this afternoon that I'd like to inform you of directly, given your role in surfacing the documentation. Are you available to come in at 4 o'clock? "I'll be there," he said. He finished his sandwich. He went back to the building. The meeting with Patricia Holt lasted 45 minutes and covered the formal outcomes in the methodical, carefully worded language that institutions use when they are describing significant events in ways that will eventually be read by lawyers. Wyatt listened. He asked clarifying questions where he needed to. He did not react to the parts that were intended to be good news in a way that suggested he had been unsure of the outcome. Because he had not been unsure, he had always known what the evidence said, and the audit had simply confirmed what he'd already documented. The formal outcomes, as Patricia Holt presented them, Dorian Voss had been removed from his position, effective immediately. The removal authorized under the terms of his employment contract in connection with conduct that violated the company's financial integrity policies. The Paladin acquisition was permanently tabled. The board had voted to refer the matter to external legal authorities for further review. And Lenora Wycliffe remained as CEO, her position affirmed by a unanimous board confidence vote that had been, Patricia Holt said, unambiguous. "Ms. Wycliffe would like to speak with you separately," Patricia Holt said at the end. "At your convenience, not urgently. But she asked me to convey that." "Okay," Wyatt said. She was also specific about something else, Patricia Holt said. She paused in the way people pause when they are about to say something that doesn't fit neatly into the formal language of the preceding conversation. She asked me to tell you that Cresthaven's operations division is being formally reviewed for structural realignment. You'll receive details through the appropriate HR channels. But the relevant point is that any revised structure will include a director-level position in operations strategy independently evaluated, compensation benchmarked externally that the board has already approved. The offer will come through formal channels, but she wanted you to know it was coming. Wyatt sat with that for a moment. That's the promotion, he said. Yes, Patricia Holt said, it is. I need to think about it, he said. Patricia Holt looked at him with an expression that communicated she had anticipated exactly this response, and was not entirely sure whether to be impressed or exasperated by it. Of course, she said. He thanked her. He shook her hand. He left. He did not go back to his desk. He went to the parking garage, got in his car, and drove to pick up Hallie from after-school program 17 minutes early, which meant he paid the equivalent of the late pickup fee in reverse, an early pickup inconvenience charge that the program had introduced because parents who arrived too early disrupted the afternoon activity schedule and sat in the waiting area, near the front desk, until the coordinator brought her out. Hallie walked in carrying a paper that had a large red A- on the top and looked deeply offended by the minus. She took points off for incomplete conclusion, Hallie announced, dropping into the chair beside him. My conclusion was complete. I concluded it. What did you conclude? That bridges are important. He looked at her. That's not quite a conclusion, he said. She gave him the expression of someone who finds this critique deeply unfair. It's true. It is, he agreed. It's also what the whole paper was about, not what you learned from writing it. Hallie chewed on this, the way she chewed on things she didn't immediately want to accept, with the particular stubborn patience of someone who is actually processing rather than simply refusing. What did I learn? I don't know, he said. What did you learn? That bridges have to distribute the weight or they break, she said, somewhat reluctantly, as though this insight had presented itself against her will. That's a conclusion, he said. She looked at the A-. Can I write a different ending? The paper's done, he said. But you can keep it in mind for next time. She sighed with the specific exhaustion of an 8-year-old who has been told something both correct and unhelpful simultaneously. Fine. He drove home. He made pasta that was somewhat better than the previous week's attempt because he'd remembered to salt the water. They ate at the kitchen table, and she told him 3 things that had happened at recess: a disputed call in a game of tag, a falling out between Joss and another girl named Priya, and the discovery of a very large beetle near the equipment shed that had apparently transfixed the entire 3rd grade for approximately 15 minutes. He listened to all 3 things with full attention. After dinner, after Hallie was in her room reading the next chapter of her current book, she'd recently advanced to longer books and attacked them with the particular intensity of someone who has discovered a new gear in themselves. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and thought about the promotion. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things that mattered. The position was real. The compensation benchmark was meaningful. The title represented a level of professional recognition that 18 months ago he would have said he wanted. The work would be good, he was suited for it, and he knew he was suited for it. And there was something honest and simple about being in a job you're genuinely equipped for. But the but was structural, not personal. If he accepted a position offered by Lenora Wycliffe to Wyatt Brenner, in the wake of everything that had happened between them, regardless of the merit of the offer, regardless of the fact that the board had approved it independently, he would spend the rest of his career at Cresthaven managing the question of whether he'd earned it or received it. Not just in other people's minds, in his own. He knew himself well enough to know that the distinction mattered to him in a way it didn't matter to everyone. Some people could accept a gift from someone who cared about them and separate the professional from the personal without remainder. He was not those people. He needed to be able to look at his own reflection and see a man who had gotten where he was because of the work. That meant the offer had to be declined. But it also meant that he needed to find another way to get where the work had actually taken him, because the work was real and the results were real, and the position they'd offered corresponded, genuinely, to what he'd earned. Not from Lenora, From the accumulation of the thing he'd been doing every day for 3 years, when it would have been easier to do less. He thought about that for a while longer. Then he made a call to a contact at an executive search firm he'd spoken to once, in November, before everything had started unraveling in ways he couldn't have predicted. He left a message. It was 7:30 in the evening, and explained that he was interested in a conversation about a specific type of position and would welcome a callback at convenience. He hung up. He drank the rest of his coffee. He felt, if not exactly clear, then at least oriented. Like a man who had taken a compass reading and confirmed that he knew which direction he was pointing. He met with Lenora the following week. She had requested the meeting on neutral professional terms, a conference room on the 14th floor, not her office, which was a small gesture he noticed and credited, and when he arrived she was already there, which was unusual for her. Lenora Wycliffe was the kind of person who entered rooms after other people were seated, not from arrogance exactly, but from the particular habit of authority. The fact that she was already there, seated, hands on the table, told him something. He sat across from her. She looked at him for a moment. "The promotion," she said. "I'm not going to accept it," he said. Something moved across her face, not surprise, he noted. Not quite relief either. Something more like recognition, the particular expression of a person who expected what they're hearing and had been waiting to see if they were right. "Because of me," she said. "Because of the situation," he said. "The offer came from a board that just watched you and I fight side by side to expose fraud. Even if every director in that room voted their conscience completely independently, I would always note that those circumstances surrounded the decision. I can't unknow it. The position is legitimate," she said. "The merit review, I know it is," he said. "That's not the problem. The problem is I need to know that I know it is, not take someone else's word for it." He paused. "Including yours." She absorbed this. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I've been in contact with an executive search firm," he said. "I'm looking at independent positions, externally benchmarked. If I find something at the right level, I'll take it. If I don't, I'll stay in my current role and keep doing the work." She was quiet for a moment, and if the right position, she said carefully, were to come through a properly structured independent review process, not offered by me, not originating with me, but posted externally, evaluated externally, with the decision made by the board's independent compensation committee without my involvement. He looked at her. "Then it would be a different offer," he said. "That can be arranged," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you that it would need to be exactly that. Not nominally independent, actually independent." She nodded. "Understood." He shifted in his chair. There was more. He'd known there was more since he sat down, and it was the more that was harder. "I need to say something else," he said. She waited. "What happened here, all of it, from November to now, was real. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't." He kept his voice even. "You came to my door. You apologized in front of people who'd witnessed the damage. You held yourself together in a room where someone was trying to take you apart, and then you told that room the truth about what had actually happened between us. All of that happened." "Yes," she said. "It's not nothing," he said. "I want to be honest about that." She looked at him. The particular quality of her attention in that moment was the most unguarded he'd ever seen. No boardroom composure, no institutional authority. Just a woman of 50 listening to a man of 32 tell her something that cost him something to say. "Thank you," she said, and it came out differently from how the same words had sounded in the conference room 3 weeks ago. Those words had been grateful. These were something more than that. "But we're not there," he said. "I don't know what we are." "I know what we're not yet. That's honest," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That's the best I've got right now." She looked down at her hands on the table for a moment, then back at him. "I can work with that," she said. He almost said something. He didn't. Instead, he nodded once and stood up. She stood also, which she didn't have to do. It was a small, unperformed gesture. The kind you make when you're not thinking about the politics of the room, but simply about the person in front of you. And they stood across the table from each other for a moment in the empty conference room on the 14th floor, while the city made its sounds through the windows. "Go home, Wyatt," she said. "I was going to," he said. He picked up his jacket and left. March moved into April. The legal process surrounding Dorian Voss's conduct was referred to external authorities. and moved with the particular glacial momentum of institutional legal proceedings, which was to say it moved, but slowly, and with enough procedural formality that Wyatt received a notification every few weeks that reminded him the matter was ongoing, without actually telling him much about its progress. He had given his statement through proper channels. He had provided his documentation. The rest was not his problem to manage. At Cresthaven, things reorganized, not dramatically. Not in the way restructuring sometimes happen, the kind with announced layoffs and shuffled org charts and performance reviews that are really screenings. This was quieter. The operations division underwent the structural review that Patricia Holt had mentioned, conducted by an external consultancy that spent 6 weeks mapping workflow and accountability chains and asking the kind of questions that reveal whether a department's results are created by its structure or despite it. Their findings, Wyatt read the summary when it was distributed to senior staff, confirmed what Wyatt had suspected for 18 months. The operations division had been producing solid results in a structure that made those results harder than they needed to be. There were reporting redundancies, accountability gaps, and at least 2 layers of process that existed because they had always existed, and not because they served a current function. The restructuring recommendations included the director-level position that had been proposed in the original offer. The posting went external. Wyatt applied. He did so formally through the external recruitment firm, submitting the same application packet any external candidate would submit: updated resume, cover letter, references from 2 contacts outside Cresthaven. He knew it was his work that had earned the shot. He also knew that the only way the shot meant anything was if he took it the right way. The evaluation process was run by the board's independent compensation committee, which comprised 2 board members and 1 external advisor, with no pre-existing relationship to Cresthaven. Wyatt was one of 6 candidates reviewed. He knew this because the external recruiter told him, and because at 3 separate points during the 4-week process, he received the specific kind of communication structured, formally worded, with clear evaluation criteria that an organization sends when it has done the work of removing informality from a process, rather than just describing it as formal. Lenora was not involved. He was told this directly by the committee chair, a board member named Dr. Amara Sisless, who had joined the board after the audit and had no relationship with any of the circumstances preceding her appointment. Dr. Silas told him at the beginning of the final interview that she had reviewed the process to ensure structural independence from the CEO's office and found it intact. "Good," Wyatt said. "You're the one who insisted on it, Doctor." Silas said, with the tone of someone who finds this specific quality of self-awareness both unusual and useful. "I needed to be able to live with the outcome either way," he said. She nodded. She asked him a question about integrated risk modeling. He answered it. The offer came formally on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of May, delivered by email from the external recruiter, with a formal offer letter attached from Cresthaven's HR function. Director of Operations Strategy. Compensation benchmark to external market data. Reporting structure that placed him outside Lenora's direct chain of authority, with a reporting line that ran through the COO to the board. He read it twice. Then he called the recruiter and accepted. He drove home, picked up Hallie from school, and on the drive back she told him without particular build-up the way children tell you the important things, not as announcements but as facts they've decided to share, that she had a new best friend named Tomas who had moved to their school from somewhere she couldn't remember, and who was, in her assessment, actually really good at tag and also kind of funny. "What about Joss?" Wyatt asked. "Joss is still my best friend," Hallie said, as though this were obvious. "Tomas is also my best friend. You can have more than one." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said, "you can." At home he made dinner, and Hallie helped in the ways she helped setting the table with the spoons on the wrong side, pouring her own juice and getting most of it in the glass, and afterward she did homework at the kitchen table while he cleaned up, and the ordinary domestic machinery of their life ran exactly as it always ran, unremarkable and functional and his. He had been thinking, since May arrived, about what Lenora had said in the conference room weeks ago. The thing she'd said about how he always went back. He turned it over sometimes, the way you turn over a sentence that has more in it than the words. He wasn't ready. He had said that in the 14th floor conference room, and it was true and he meant it. But not ready was not the same as never. Not ready was the name for a specific location in time, not a conclusion about what time eventually allowed. He understood the difference between those things. He had asked himself, on the nights when Hallie was asleep and the house was quiet, and his thoughts had enough room to wander further than the immediate, what it would take to get there. What he actually needed. The answer he kept arriving at was the same each time. He needed to have gotten there himself. The job, the standing, the professional ground under his feet, he needed it to be his, built by his work, not received from anyone's hands, regardless of how well-intentioned those hands were. He needed to stand beside whoever he stood beside as a man who had arrived there under his own power. He had that now, not perfectly. His new role came with a transition period and a learning curve and colleagues who were watching to see how the incoming director handled himself. He had stepped into a position with visibility he hadn't operated at before and knew that the first 6 months would require kind of careful attention that left little room for error. He was not naive about any of this, but the ground was solid. It was his, and somewhere in the rearrangement of his understanding of what that meant, there was room now, small, careful, not announced, for a different kind of question. He was not going to rush it, but he was no longer not thinking about it. It was a Thursday evening in late May, 5 days after he'd formally started in the new role, when he came home to find a handwritten note pushed through the mail slot. Not an email, a note, on heavy paper, the kind that costs something, in handwriting that was precise and slightly formal, and that he recognized because he'd seen it once before, on a printed card set on his keyboard on a December morning. The note said dinner. No company business, no favors. No pressure. Just 2 people. Will you come, L? And below it, a phone number. He stood in the hallway, holding it. Hallie came thundering down the stairs with the energy of a person who has been waiting for him to get home so that she can continue a conversation that existed entirely in her own head and which she assumed he was already participating in. Dad, I need to tell you about the beetle situation. The equipment shed beetle? There are more of them. Tomas says they might be a colony. That's probably fine, he said. Tomas says Hallie. He held up the note. She looked at it, then at him, with the specific expression of an 8-year-old deciding whether an adult thing is interesting enough to engage with or should be filed under not my business. Is that from a person? She asked. Yes, he said. What kind of person? He thought about how to answer that. Someone I'm still figuring out, he said. Hallie considered this with unexpected seriousness. Is figuring out good or bad? He looked at the note in his hand. I think it depends on whether you decide it's worth the figuring, he said. She thought about that for approximately 4 seconds, which was about as long as any single concept retained her attention when there was a beetle colony situation pending. Okay, she said, and headed for the kitchen. Can we have the pasta again tonight? Not the jar kind, the kind you actually made. Sure, he said. The jar kind is fine, but your kind is better, she said from the kitchen. He stood in the hallway a moment longer, holding the note, and thought about a woman who had appeared at this same door in November, in the rain, uncertain in a way that revealed something real, who had apologized publicly when she didn't have to, who had sat in a conference room telling a board of directors the truth about the most personally uncomfortable thing she could have said without flinching, who had given him room for 3 months when room was what he needed. He was not the same man who had stood in this hallway in November, deciding not to let himself want something complicated. He had spent those months becoming someone who had earned the right to choose from a position of stability rather than necessity. That was different. That mattered. He got out his phone. He typed a message to the number on the note. It said, yes. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went into the kitchen to make pasta the right way. And Hallie stood on the step stool she still needed to reach the counter and handed him ingredients in the wrong order and told him about the beetle colony with the comprehensive detail of someone who has been waiting all afternoon to debrief, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of their ordinary life. His phone buzzed once. He didn't look at it right away. He looked at it after dinner, when Hallie was in her room, and the single word on the screen was Saturday. He put the phone down on the counter. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to check on Hallie, and she was reading with the flashlight under the covers, which she believed was invisible from the doorway, and he stood in the dark hallway for a moment deciding whether to call her on it. He decided not to. He went to his own room and lay in the dark, and for the first time in a long time, he thought about Saturday with something other than inventory of what needed to get done before it arrived. Saturday arrived the way important days often do, indistinguishable from any other morning until you're already in it. Wyatt woke at 5:15 out of habit, lay in the dark for approximately 90 seconds, then accepted that sleeping past his alarm was not a skill he possessed and got up. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched the backyard in the early light, the small square of grass, the fence with the loose board he'd been meaning to fix for 4 months. The bird feeder Hallie had insisted on, and which attracted mostly squirrels, and one very determined cardinal who had apparently decided the squirrels were not his problem. Normal morning, normal light. Except for the specific quality of awareness sitting somewhere in his chest that was different from the ordinary Saturday awareness of a man calculating what needed doing before the week resumed. Hallie came downstairs at 7:20, which was early for a Saturday, wearing one sock and carrying the other, and announced that she was hungry. "There's cereal," he said. "I want eggs. I can do eggs." "Scrambled," she said. "But not dry. Last time they were dry." "Last time you were at school when I made them," he said. "I heard about it from you," she said, with complete confidence in the reliability of this information chain. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and put her chin in her hands and watched him with the particular attentiveness of someone who intends to supervise. "Are you going somewhere today?" "Yes," he said. He cracked the first egg. "Dinner later." "With who?" He considered the question. "You've heard me mention Lenora," he said. Hallie thought about it. "The work lady? She's someone I work with." "Used to work directly with." He added the second egg. "We're having dinner." Hallie processed this with the lateral seriousness that 8-year-olds apply to adult information that has an unfamiliar shape. "Like a date?" He stirred the eggs. "Yes. Have you been on a date before?" she asked. "Since Mom?" He kept his attention on the pan. "No," he said. Hallie was quiet for a moment. He was aware of the particular quality of her silence. She had her mother's capacity for silence that was not empty. "Is that okay?" she asked finally, and the question was so unadorned, so genuinely curious without agenda, that it caught him somewhere in the throat. He turned to look at her. "Yeah, bug," he said. "I think it is." She nodded, as though this had been a legitimate question requiring a legitimate answer, and she was satisfied with both. "Don't make a reservation somewhere too fancy," she advised. "Fancy places make everyone nervous." He put the eggs on a plate and set it in front of her. "When did you become an expert on this?" he asked. "Joss's dad went on a date and he wore a tie, and the lady thought he was trying too hard," she said, and began eating with the focused efficiency of someone who has opinions about eggs and is currently confirming whether this batch meets her standards. He watched her eat. "Were they okay?" he asked. "The eggs?" "Better," she said. "Still a little dry." He made a note of it. He picked up Lenora at 7:30. She came out of her building, a tall residential tower, in the kind of neighborhood that communicated wealth without announcing it, before he'd had a chance to text that he'd arrived, which told him she'd been watching for the car. This detail, small and undefended, told him more about where she was in this than anything she could have said. She was wearing dark trousers and a charcoal sweater, her hair down in a way he'd never seen in any professional setting. And she looked, he registered this, without letting it become a thought, he examined too closely like a person rather than a role. She got into the passenger seat, closed the door, and turned to look at him. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Neither of them moved for a second. "I haven't done this in a while," she said. "Dinner?" he asked. "Getting into a car with someone who isn't a driver," she said, and there was something in it that was almost self-mocking, the particular tone of someone acknowledging the absurdity of their own life from the outside. He pulled into traffic. The restaurant was not fancy. He had taken Hallie's advice, partly because it was sound advice, and partly because she was 8 and had given it with complete authority, and he found that sort of thing difficult to ignore. It was an Italian place 12 blocks from his house that had 20 tables, 2 owners who had been running it since before Wyatt had moved to the city, and pasta that was better than anything on the menu price suggested it should be. They got a table near the window. The server, a young man named Paolo, who had been working there since at least the previous year, and who knew Wyatt well enough to drop a breadbasket without being asked, took their drink orders and left. Lenora looked around the restaurant. "You've been here before," she said. Many times, he said. Hallie calls it the red tablecloth place. She considers it the official restaurant of all good occasions. Lenora's mouth curved slightly. That's a real recommendation. Highest I know, he said. They ordered. The food arrived without the kind of delay that makes a first dinner feel like an endurance event. And they ate, and they talked in the way that people talk when they are not managing the conversation but simply having it, following the actual shape of what comes up rather than steering toward prepared topics. She told him about building Cresthaven from the consulting firm it had started as. Not the version she told interviews, the polished narrative with its clean through line of vision and execution, but the actual version which included a year where she hadn't paid herself a salary. A partnership that had collapsed badly enough that she'd had to restructure the company's legal foundation from scratch. And a decision she'd made in year 4 that she still wasn't certain had been right and had simply turned out well, which she said was not the same thing. Most of what people call vision, she said, pulling a piece of bread apart, is just the story you tell afterward about a series of bets you made under pressure. That's either very honest or very cynical, he said. Maybe both, she said. I've had time to get comfortable with both. He told her about Claire, not as a confession or a warning or a preemptive explanation, but because it was part of his actual life and actual conversations between actual people include the real parts. He told her that Claire had died when Hallie was 6, that the 2 years since had rearranged him in ways he was still identifying, that he had gotten better at most things and remained genuinely bad at asking for help from other people. I noticed, Lenora said. Yeah, he said, it's a known issue. It's not entirely bad, she said, the self-sufficiency. It's not entirely good either, he said. She nodded. No, it isn't. She picked up her wine glass. I have the same problem for what it's worth. Different source, same result. What's the source? He asked. She thought about it. Not performing consideration, actually thinking, with the pause of someone who doesn't usually answer this kind of question and is deciding whether to answer it correctly or conveniently. I learned very early, she said, that needing things from people gave them leverage. And leverage, in my experience, was usually used. She set the glass down. So I stopped needing things, or I convinced myself I had. He looked at her across the small table in the warm light of the red tablecloth place and thought about a woman who had shown up at his door in November with no assistant and no prepared answer, uncertain in a way she clearly hadn't been in years, saying the honest thing instead of the strategic one. How'd that work out? He asked. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who finds a question both obvious and fair. I built $1 billion company, she said, and I was alone at 50 in a way I hadn't admitted to myself until I was standing on a stranger's porch in the rain. The restaurant made its sounds around them, other tables, the sound of the kitchen, Paolo passing with a tray, and they sat with what she'd said in the comfortable way that things can be sat with when both people in a conversation have decided to be honest. I'm not a stranger anymore, he said. No, she said. You're not. They walked 2 blocks after dinner because the night was mild and neither of them was in a hurry, and the city at 9 on a Saturday had a particular quality that Wyatt had always liked, populated but not urgent. The specific tempo of people who are somewhere by choice rather than obligation. They were not holding hands. They were walking close enough that the distance between them was deliberate in a different way than distance usually is. Can I ask you something? Lenora said. Yes, he said. When you came to the board meeting, she said, in February, when you walked in and sat down, she paused. You knew what you were walking into. Yes, he said. Why did you do it? He walked for a step or two before answering. Because the truth was in my bag, he said, and leaving would have meant choosing to let it stay there. She was quiet. That's it, she said. That's most of it, he said. What's the rest? He thought about how to say the rest. The rest was harder to say cleanly because it involved admitting something that had existed before he'd been ready to name it, and naming things retrospectively required the specific kind of honesty that felt like exposure. I didn't want you to lose, he said. Not just the company. You. He kept his eyes on the sidewalk ahead of them. That was already there, in November. I just didn't know what to do with it. She was quiet long enough that he glanced at her. She was looking ahead, and her expression was the one he had come to recognize as Lenora, not performing any version of herself, just present, taking something in, letting it be real. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Thank you for asking, he said. They walked the rest of the block and turned back toward where he'd parked. And it was only when they reached the car, and he opened the passenger door, and she stopped with her hand on the roof and turned to face him, that either of them acknowledged what the end of this evening actually was. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm not in a rush," he said. "I need you to know that. Whatever this is, I'm not measuring it against a timeline." "Neither am I," she said. "For the first time in a long time, actually." "Good," he said. She hesitated for just a moment, not uncertainty. Something more considered than that, and then she reached out and put her hand briefly against the side of his face. The kind of touch that doesn't ask for anything and doesn't promise anything, and is simply true in the moment it exists. Then she got in the car. He closed the door. He stood on the sidewalk for a second in the May night air and acknowledged quietly and without making a production of it that something had shifted in him that was going to take time to fully understand. That was okay. He was getting better at letting things take the time they needed. What followed was not a transformation. It wasn't a sudden renovation of two people into better versions of themselves. It was slower and more uneven and more real than that, which is to say it was the actual thing rather than the idea of the thing. Lenora came to dinner on a Tuesday in June, the first time she came to the house as something other than an accident of geography. Hallie was doing homework at the kitchen table when she arrived, and she looked up and took stock of Lenora with the frank, unhurried assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise curiosity as politeness. "You're the work lady," Hallie said. "I am," Lenora said. "Dad says you used to be his boss." "That's right." Hallie considered this. "Are you still his boss?" "No," Lenora said. "Good," Hallie said. "He said you were kind of mean to him." "Hallie," Wyatt said from the stove. She was, though, Hallie said, without rancor, just stating a thing that had entered her information and been filed accordingly. She looked at Lenora. "Were you mean to him?" Lenora, to her credit, did not perform contrition or deflect the question or look to Wyatt for rescue. She looked at the 8-year-old in front of her and said, "Yes, I was." Hallie absorbed this. "My friend Tomas was mean to me in December," she said, "and then he wasn't mean anymore, and now he's my best friend." So she returned to her homework with the finality of someone who has rendered a judgment and considers the matter closed. Wyatt looked at Lenora from across the kitchen. Lenora looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything adequate to say. The months that followed taught them things about each other that meetings and boardrooms and professional crisis cannot teach the texture of actual daily life, which is where you find out who people really are when nothing is at stake. Lenora was not easy. That was the first thing. She had opinions about everything and stated them without softening them, which was sometimes useful and sometimes required Wyatt to say directly that he'd asked for her view on dinner and not a strategic assessment of the restaurant's operational efficiency. She was not naturally comfortable with Hallie's particular brand of chaos, the markers left on every surface, the half-finished projects colonizing the coffee table, the questions that arrived without preamble and required immediate answers on topics ranging from beetle biology to whether sharks dream. She did not pretend to be comfortable when she wasn't. That turned out to matter. She made mistakes. She showed up one Saturday with expensive seats to a performance she thought Hallie would enjoy, and Hallie was polite about it and then bored within 20 minutes because she was 8 and the performance was not designed for 8-year-olds. And afterward, Lenora sat in the car afterward, feeling the specific failure of a person who has planned something carefully and misjudged the audience entirely. Wyatt had told her gently that with Hallie the move was usually to ask rather than to decide. "I'm not used to asking," Lenora said. "I know," he said. "Start small." The following Saturday, Lenora arrived with no plan and asked Hallie what she wanted to do. Hallie, who had been waiting approximately 4 weeks for this moment, said she wanted to go to the hardware store to get materials for her bridge project, then to the park, then to the red tablecloth place for dinner. "That's very specific," Lenora said. "I've been thinking about it," Hallie said. They went to the hardware store. Lenora held a bag of wooden dowels and a package of zip ties and looked at a child explaining the load-bearing principles of suspension bridges with the specific focus of someone who had not, until this moment, considered that the most interesting conversation she might have on a Saturday afternoon would be with a 3rd grader about structural engineering. "This part," Hallie said, indicating a diagram she'd printed from a library book, is where you need the cables to distribute the weight. Otherwise, the whole thing just falls. Lenora looked at the diagram. You need the weight spread across the whole structure, she said, not concentrated in one place. Exactly, Hallie said, with the satisfaction of someone whose expertise has been correctly recognized. Lenora caught Wyatt's eye over Hallie's head. He raised his eyebrows slightly. She looked like someone who had just understood something that went beyond the diagram. The year moved the way years move when you are inside them, faster than you expect, slower than you fear, accumulating in increments that only become visible when you look back over a significant distance. Wyatt's new role at Cresthaven settled around him, the way good work settles not easily, but correctly. The first 6 months were the hardest, as he'd known they would be, involving a learning curve on the director level that required him to manage people rather than simply produce results himself, which was a different skill set that he was developing with the same deliberate attention he applied to everything. He made mistakes. He acknowledged them, adjusted, kept going. He was better at his job by October than he'd been in May, and he knew he would be better still by the following May. And that trajectory, not the position or the title, but the specific experience of growing into something through the work of showing up for it, was the thing he had always needed. He and Lenora did not work in the same functional chain anymore. They occupied the same building, attended some of the same all-company events, occasionally passed in the corridor in the specific way that professionals pass each other, when they are also something else, a glance that carries more than professional acknowledgement, but does not make a production of it. They saw each other outside work twice a week, sometimes 3 times. It was not a perfect arrangement. Lenora's schedule operated on a logic that was not always compatible with a household governed partly by a school calendar and a child's unwavering conviction that Saturday morning pancakes were non-negotiable. Wyatt burned the pancakes more often than not. Lenora burned them reliably and without apology, which Hallie had decided after initial skepticism was at least consistent. Yours are worse than Dad's, Hallie told her one October morning, examining a pancake with the critical eye of someone who has standards. I know, Lenora said. But you tried, Hallie said, in the magnanimous tone of a child extending credit where credit is due. I always try, Lenora said. Hallie looked at her. That's enough. Probably, she said, and ate the pancake. Wyatt, from behind his coffee cup, watched the two of them at his kitchen table and felt something settle in his chest that had been quietly unsettled for 2 years. Not fixed settled, there is a difference. Fixed implies the broken thing is gone. Settled means you've found a way to live with the weight of everything, so that it becomes part of the structure rather than something fighting the structure. He had learned to live with loss. He had learned to lead with honesty, even when honesty was the more expensive choice. He had learned that self-sufficiency taken too far becomes its own kind of isolation, and that asking for help was not the same as giving someone leverage over you, it was just asking for help. He was still learning these things. You don't finish learning them. But he was further along than he'd been, and the direction was right, and that was what he held on to. November arrived exactly 1 year from the night Lenora had stood on his front porch in the rain. He didn't mark it formally. He wasn't a person who made ceremonies out of things that other people might. But he was aware of it, in the way you're aware of certain dates that have weight not oppressively, just present, like a piece of furniture in a room you've rearranged so many times it finally looks like it belongs there. On a Friday afternoon in the second week of November, he was in a conference room on the 12th floor, finishing a quarterly review with 2 members of his team, when his assistant knocked and said there was a call he might want to take. He wrapped up, took the call. It was the external legal firm handling the Dorian Voss matter. The process had concluded. The referral to external authorities had resulted in a settlement that included substantial financial penalties, mandatory cooperation with regulators, and a formal bar from serving in senior financial roles at publicly traded companies for a period of 10 years. Dorian had not admitted wrongdoing in the settlement's formal language, which was not unusual, and which told Wyatt everything about Dorian's character that he'd already known. The Paladin Group, for what it was worth, had been acquired 6 months later by a different firm at the accurate valuation the one Wyatt's original models had supported, and the deal had worked out moderately well for everyone involved, which was how moderately well-priced acquisitions usually went. Wyatt thanked the lawyer, ended the call, and sat in the empty conference room for a moment. He felt not triumph, not the specific satisfaction of having been vindicated publicly. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a chapter ending in the particular, undramatic way that most chapters end, not with a climax but with a matter-of-fact final sentence that simply completes the thought. He texted Lenora, "The Voss matter is settled. Thought you'd want to know." She replied within 2 minutes, "I heard this morning." "Are you okay?" He looked at the question. He typed, "Yeah. I'm okay." Then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. December came with its particular momentum, and Hallie had a school performance in which she played a tree, not a speaking role, but one she had invested considerable creative energy in, developing what she described as a specific personality for her tree that was, as far as Wyatt could tell from the performance, expressed primarily through the angle at which she held her arms. Lenora came. She sat beside Wyatt in the school auditorium on a folding chair that was not designed for adult spines, in a room that smelled like floor wax and construction paper, surrounded by parents with phones held up at awkward angles, and watched an 8-year-old be a tree with a specific personality. Afterward, Hallie found them in the crowd and said, without preamble, "Could you tell it was an oak specifically?" "I was trying to be an oak." "I could tell," Lenora said. Hallie looked at her narrowly. "Really? Your branch angles," Lenora said. "Oaks have a particular structure." Hallie stared at her for a moment, then turned to Wyatt with an expression that communicated, in the fluent language they had developed across 8 years, "She's okay, actually." He gave a small nod. Hallie accepted this and moved on to telling them about the backstage situation, which had apparently involved a disagreement between 2 fourth graders and a costume malfunction that she'd described with the relish of someone who has witnessed history. They walked to the red tablecloth place afterward. It was a Tuesday. Paolo was working. The breadbasket arrived on request, and Hallie talked through most of dinner, and Lenora asked questions that were genuine rather than polite, and Wyatt ate his pasta and watched the two of them across the table. He thought about something a colleague had said to him once, years before any of this, a woman who had been at the company Wyatt worked at before Cresthaven, who had known his wife Claire, and who had told him, at Claire's memorial, that grief changes the shape of a person, but it doesn't change who they are. He had not fully believed her at the time. He had been too inside it. He believed her now. He was not the same man who had stood at Claire's grave 2 years ago and tried to understand how to be a father and a person simultaneously when the person he'd built that life with wasn't there to build it with anymore. He was not the man who had stood in an elevator after a board meeting and decided quietly to leave somewhere he'd worked too hard to keep. He was not the man who had opened a front door on a November night and found something standing outside that he hadn't been ready for. He was all of those men. Still, you don't shed the versions of yourself. You carry them, but he was more than them now. You become more than your worst moments and your hardest years by living through them and choosing on the other side to do the thing that costs something. Over and over, in small ways and large ones. The choice to tell the truth when the easier option is available. The choice to stay when leaving is safer. The choice to let someone in when you have very good reasons to keep the door managed. He had made those choices imperfectly. He would continue to make them imperfectly. That was the human condition, not a failure. You did the best version of yourself you could manage on the day you had, and then you got up and tried again. In the spring of the following year, on a Saturday morning when the pancakes had come out better than usual, not good, but better, and Hallie had acknowledged the improvement with a brief nod that in her household carried the weight of a standing ovation, Wyatt asked Lenora to stay. Not for breakfast, not for the afternoon. He meant something larger, and he said it plainly, without engineering the moment, because he had learned that the moments that matter don't require engineering, they require honesty. They were standing in the kitchen, the remnants of breakfast on the table, Hallie having disappeared into the backyard with a notebook, and the stated intention of documenting beetle activity that she believed had become more organized over the winter. "I want to stop being something we're figuring out," he said. "I want to be something we've decided on." Lenora looked at him. "That's not a question," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't. The question is whether you want the same thing." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering, which was different, the particular care of someone who had made decisions quickly all her life, and had recently learned to take the additional second that honest answers require. I've been wanting that for a while, she said. I didn't want to push it. I know, he said. I'm not easy, she said. I'm still not good at this. The ordinary parts. I know that too, he said. Hallie called you the oak lady to Tomas, he said. I consider that a good sign. Lenora absorbed this. Then she did something he hadn't seen in the months he'd known her. She laughed. Not the controlled, almost smile he'd catalogued across a year of careful distances. A real laugh, short and caught, the kind that escapes before a person can decide whether to allow it. It changed her face completely. He thought about the woman he'd met in a boardroom 12 months before, composed and formidable, and apparently self-sufficient in a way that had looked, from the outside, like it cost nothing. He thought about what it actually costs to build walls that thorough. He thought about what it takes to dismantle them, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in 100 small decisions to let someone see the thing behind the wall instead of just the wall. She had done that, imperfectly, inconsistently, at times in ways that required him to push back and name the thing clearly, and refuse to accept less than what he'd asked for. And he had done it too, the same way. That, he thought, was what it actually looked like. Not two people bringing out the best in each other effortlessly. Two people committed to doing the work of that on the days it came naturally, and especially on the days it didn't. Yes, she said, I want the same thing. He nodded. Then he went to the back door and called Hallie in from her beetle documentation, and she came in complaining that he was interrupting a critical observation window, and he said he had something to tell her. And she looked at him, and then at Lenora, and then back at him with the specific expression of a child who has already arrived at the destination before the adult has finished giving directions. Okay, she said simply. That's it, he said. What else is there? She said. I already knew. She looked at Lenora. Are you moving in? Not immediately, Lenora said. Okay, Hallie said. We'll need more shelf space eventually. Dad's books are taking up too much. She turned and went back to the door. Can I go back to the Beatles? Yes, he said. She went. He and Lenora stood in the kitchen, in the ordinary morning light of an ordinary Saturday, and the moment did not announce itself as significant. It was just a moment like most significant moments, unremarkable on the surface and carrying everything underneath. He put a cup of coffee in her hands. She took it. They stood at the kitchen window and watched Hallie in the backyard, crouched near the fence, recording near the fence with her notebook, her saying something with great seriousness, and her conclusions probably more decisive than the evidence warranted. She had her mother's eyelashes and her mother's stubbornness and her mother's unshakable certainty that the world was worth paying close attention to. She also had a father who had figured out slowly and with difficulty and without a clean blueprint how to keep choosing the life in front of him instead of the safer version of a life he might have settled for. That was the thing worth saying. If anything in this story is worth saying, not that love solves things, because it doesn't. Not that time heals everything, because it only makes some things bearable and others navigable. But that the decision, the specific, ongoing, renewable decision, to be honest with someone, to show up at the true weight of things rather than a managed version of yourself, is not a one-time event. It is a practice. It is a choice you make again every morning, and some mornings it costs more than others, and some mornings it comes easily enough that you almost forget it took everything you had to get here. Almost. Wyatt stood at his kitchen window on a spring morning, holding coffee he hadn't drunk yet, and did not forget. He was grateful for that. He turned from the window, and Lenora was looking at him, and he thought, not for the last time, but clearly, the way you think things when they're finally true, that this was the shape of his life now. Imperfect, specific, his. He drank his coffee. Outside, Hallie had found what she was looking for and was writing it down with great concentration, recording the small world in her backyard with the conviction that it deserved to be recorded, and the morning light moved through the yard the way light does in spring, unhurried, indifferent to whether you appreciated it, present regardless. Wyatt watched his daughter, and then the woman beside him, and then his daughter again. Then he went to do the dishes, because someone had to, and because ordinary life does not pause for its own significance, which is mostly a mercy. The dishes needed doing, so he did them.